Today's reading, and it's on the topic of modesty. Now, modesty is one of those virtues that we don't often speak about. We speak about certainly the qualities that go with it, but addressing it directly, not so often. And so I'd like to share a few words about that this morning, or this evening. I keep saying morning because I happen to be in America doing this from here to Nanda Village, so excuse me. Although I know in India it's evening time. Be modest. Be even self-effacing. But don't belittle yourself. Self-depreciation, too, brings a focus on the ego. There should be neither superiority nor an inferiority complex. Concentrate on the what of things, not the who. Swami Kriyananda would often repeat a story from his own life that he enjoyed quite a bit. He would always, when he would tell this story, he'd always end it with a laugh because he found it amusing. And he was at a social engagement of some sort at some point some years ago. And there was a crowd of people there, and as normally happens at such gatherings, you meet many people you don't know, and you mix with people, and you introduce yourself, one person to another, and chat a little bit. And he was doing this, and he introduced himself to a young lady, and hello, how are you? And he said, my name is Swami Kriyananda. And she said, oh, but Swami Kriyananda, but you're famous. And Swami said, well, yes, I'm Swami Kriyananda, and yes, I suppose perhaps I am known, but why do you use the word but? And she said, well, but you don't seem very important. And Swami always, when he told that story, he would start laughing. And he said, well, that was good. He took it as a compliment. And then and that he wasn't very important. He didn't think of himself as important. He had no sense of self-importance. He was just who he was. And the world, if some people thought he was famous or important, well, that was for them to decide. But in his own mind, he was just a disciple of Master and a disciple of Paramahansa Yogananda. And he said, he pointed this out as a common tendency that people have. They tend to engage in exaggerating their sense of importance, and people want to be seen in a good light, and they exalt when things go well or they do something well. In sports, teams will say, yes, we're number one, we're better than you, and there's this competitive spirit, and they exalt their successes and perhaps at the failures of others. And you see this in the VIP culture that is so very prominent. People have their entourages and their escorts, and you see this particularly in Delhi, where the politicians have all of the silly things that they go about in that mode of exaggerated importance, self-importance. Well, Swamiji was not that way at all. He was a very humble man, and in this case, modest man is what we're speaking about today. Modesty is a wonderful virtue, and I think every parent who raises a child in some way or another understands this and tries to instill this in their children. Because children, of course, as they're growing up and their egos begin to develop, they have that sense of expansion, and they want to be number one, and they want to exalt in their own successes. And of course, the parents like that too. They want the children to succeed, but on the other hand, they don't want their children to get an inflated sense of who and what they are, and so they usually try to curb that and say, no, modesty is a virtue that needs to be practiced, and modesty is, in this sense, it is actually a practice that all of us, particularly those of us on the spiritual path, need to actually engage in, because what modesty is doing, the practice of modesty, is learning to curb that tendency of the ego to exalt itself, to make ourselves stand up above the crowd in the egoic sense, and to inflate oneself. But also, very much sometimes, another part of modesty as well is to also not fall into the trap of degrading ourselves as well, because that too is an egoic tendency. It's an involvement, a sense of identification with the self in a false way, because we're neither great in the inward sense. We're neither great, other than all souls are great, but in the egoic sense, we're not exalted, nor are we degraded. We're just simply a soul, and who and what we are. We stand alone before God, and we're children of the divine. But one is no better or worse than any other, and we have to see ourselves in that light. But in this world, in this engaging outwardly in our day-to-day activities, there is this tendency, this egoic tendency to want to stand up above the crowd and to exalt ourselves, this identification with this ego. And the problem with this is there's a certain untruthfulness to it, because it's not a reality, and it's outwardly identifying with something that we really are not. And so this is, of course, what the devotee in the spiritual path is trying to overcome, this false sense of identification, either too high in a superiority complex or too low in an inferiority complex. And we have to moderate these two. Now, it's interesting to contrast this virtue of modesty with also one that's very similar and has many of the same qualities, and that would be humility. Modesty and humility. Yes, often they're used interchangeably, but technically there is a slight difference if we go by a precise spiritual definition of humility. Humility, Paramahansa Yogananda and Swami Kriyananda would emphasize, is the complete absence of a sense of self-identity. Somebody once complimented Paramahansa Yogananda. He said, "Oh, you're so humble, sir. It's your humility." And when he deflected certain praise, "Oh, you're being so humble, sir." And he said, "How can there be humility when there is no sense of self, no consciousness of self?" And so it's true. When there's that no egoic identity, where is there humility? And this is what being humble really is, and that's in a very exalted state. So you could say that the practice of modesty, which is the curbing of that exaggerated sense of self, either high or low, that it's a restraining, you might say, of that egoic tendency to go out and I'm number one, that tendency to restrain it. And in that process and the engagement of that leads to ultimately leads to a pure sense of what it means to be humble. So in this, there's something also that needs to be understood, because there's also a false sense of modesty as well, and we don't want that as well. Many people also make the mistake of thinking, well, to be modest is to, because it's derived, modesty, the word modesty is derived from the root word for moderation. We want to be moderate, you can say. Now, moderate in the sense of not up or not down. It's even, you might say. And this again is a yogic principle, even-minded and cheerful, moderate in our emotional reactions to this world, the likes and dislikes of this world. That too could be thought of as moderate, but having that evenness, not too high, not too low, it comes from that word of moderation. And so some people interpret that, well, I don't want to stand out. And so consequently, that could be taken to the next misunderstanding. Say, well, I don't want to stand out, so therefore I want to be one of the crowd. And so consequently, what everybody else is doing, I'm going to do that too. And even if perhaps it's not a good thing, or perhaps it's not helpful, or perhaps it means that I have to somehow suppress my own sense of what's right in order to be accepted by the crowd. There's a saying in Japan that it said the nail that sticks up is hammered down. And as you see it sometimes in the floorboards, if a little nail is up, it's hammered down. So consequently, don't be a nail that's sticking up. Well, I think there's some value to that. But on the other hand, what if everybody else is wrong and you feel that something's right? Don't you want to perhaps say something? So this you do. You're standing up for a principle, but you're not standing up for your egoic sense. You see this in people sometimes. They just want to be different, not because difference is a matter of principle of right versus wrong. They just want to be rebellious because everybody's going that way. I want to go this way, so look at me. Now that's not quite the right thing what we're saying. But if there's a principle at stake, you stand up for the principle, not for yourself. You could say that little self. For the higher self, yes, but not for that little self, just to exalt yourself or to make yourself attention being drawn to your egoic identity. It's the principle that's the important thing that you're standing up for. Even in little things, I remember years ago, I was in Italy. This was in the 1990s, middle of the 1990s, and I went to Italy. It was in the wintertime. And everybody in Italy, and the fashion was at that time, that if you wanted to dress nicely, you wore black. And I looked around, and it seemed to me everybody was wearing black. There were a few people wearing brown. And if you really wanted to be radical, you wore gray. And it was, to me, it was depressing, although socially it was high fashion. And I just can't wear these kinds of clothes. So I would wear other colors. I wear blue, or sometimes I wear color, just not because I was being rebellious against the fashion, but just it was an affirmation of my own higher sense of joyfulness, of being happy from inside and wanting to express that outwardly. So, but you see this in little ways. Nevertheless, there's a fine line. Sometimes people like to rebel just for the sake of having people look at them, like the peacock has beautiful feathers, so it attracts the other birds, the female birds, I suppose, to look at them. We don't want to be like that. Now, on the deeper level, though, what we are looking for is moderation, that curbing of the ego's tendency to go out. That's what we're talking about. Modesty is really not something outward. Yes, we talk about being modest in dress, being modest in your behavior, being modest in your outward expressions, but really what we're doing is we're curbing that inwardly. It's that moderating the inner tendency to identify, the inner tendency of the ego. And this is a practice, and I say it's a quality, but it's also a practice. And I wanted to share some practices that Swami Kriyananda shares in his book, Sadhu Beware. And he has in that book a list of 25, and he just is touching the surface because he could have gone on, but he lists 25 practices that we might want to do to help restrain that egoic tendency, and in the process of that, approaching life in a more modest, moderate egoic sense. Now, I'm going to share some of these and discuss them, but I want to mention that some of them, they are things that people say, well, I don't, why should I do that? The worldly person would think that naturally. Why should I do that? It seems counter to what we normally would do in life. So it's best if I mention that these were written for the serious devotee. He said, Sadhu, beware. He was addressing him to those, to our sadhu tendencies, the aspiration that we have to be liberated, to be true souls in God. And so they're not necessarily addressed to the world at large, although they should be. But they wouldn't necessarily be understood by the world at large. And so I'd like to share a few of these. And these, again, are, you could say, as practices in the art of moderation, ego moderation, and by extension, practices in the art of modesty. And I'm going to skip, I'm not going to do all 25, but I'd like to pick a few out that struck me. Swami says, when someone else gets the credit for something you've done, don't look for a way of letting people know where the credit really belongs. It would be natural enough for you to do that. You needn't even consider it a fault. Still, don't make too much of it. You will find much greater freedom in your heart if you mentally give all credit to God. You see, and he makes a point here also. He says, yes, and you see this all the time. Somebody, your coworker, you came up with a brilliant idea, and your coworker mentions it, and getting the credit, and there's a tendency, yes, but that was my idea. I got that, and you want to deflect the credit back to yourself. Why? Why is it necessary? Why not let the other fellow have the credit as well? And on a deeper level, there's a point there, because you are that other fellow on the deepest level, to think, no, not him, me. You're affirming in the sense that you're not him. Why not be expansive? And if you can find joy when other people receive credit, then you know you've been able to extend your sense of self to embrace that other person. But that tendency to deflect it back to yourself only increases and affirms that sense of separation from that other person. And the other point that Swamiji makes right at the end here is, give credit, realize, mentally give all the credit to God. Because yes, we deflect that exaggerated attention away from the ego, but at the same time, we have to also have a positive approach as well. And giving all credit it's deflecting it away from the ego and focusing it upon something higher, in this case, the divine, toward God. So we withdraw and then we rechannel. And this is the spiritual path. There's always those two sides, the withdrawal and the redirection of our energy, the withdrawal of energy and the redirection of energy in the direction that we want it to go. In this case, giving all credit to God. And God expresses through you, through me, and through our co-worker as well. And besides, no idea belongs to any one of us. It's a universal principle. And if it's a good idea, it was in the ether, and you just happened to pick up on it first. But it was not yours to begin with. It just, you noticed it first. Secondly, another one. When someone has a good idea that you've had already, it will help you in the practice to tell yourself it's the idea that counts, not the person who had it. Reply simply, therefore, that's a good idea. Let's give it a try. And of course, that's just an extension of what I said. It's the idea that it's important, not the who. It's the what, not the who. And we want to often, the ego's tendencies will want to be the who. You see, these tendencies, yes, they're polite behavior in company, or you might say more exalted behavior of a true gentleman or a true lady in public discourse and interchange. But nevertheless, the deeper message here is it's learning to curb that egoic tendency and to direct it and see that, no, it's God's world. This is God's work. If someone scolds you for something you didn't do, you may see some good reason for letting him know that you're not guilty. But if it doesn't really matter who did it, however, you will gain more spiritually if you say nothing. Now, this is a hard one for a lot of people, to be able to, you're falsely accused. I remember as a child once, I was accused of stealing some money to buy ice cream for myself. And I was so indignant. You can see, I still remember it now, 60-some years later. I was so indignant that I should be falsely accused. And I just protested about it. And of course, for a child, of course, that's what I probably should have done. And I didn't just accept it because I didn't understand. have the understanding. But we see this in many different little things in life. If you're a devotee and now consciously, intentionally on the spiritual path of trying to practice modesty, if it doesn't matter, is what Swami says, if it doesn't matter. Now, there are times when you're falsely accused where you do need to speak up. You have to, because you're letting an energy in motion that's going in the wrong way not to be corrected. And so but if you do it not from the sense of defending yourself or because your ego has been bruised a little bit, you see, you're doing it from a sense of wanting to affirm the truth, well, then that's, that there's appropriate times for that. But here again, but Swami says, if it doesn't matter, he says sometimes it can be a good exercise just to absorb it. How does it feel? How does it feel? Can you deal with this? Let it be. And you'll see if you can do this joyfully and cheerfully, he says you'll be the benefit. It's like building a muscle. Sometimes when you have to do weightlifting and you're building muscles, it can actually be a little painful at the time. But in the end, if you do it, you gain the strength and you're the one who ultimately benefits. Another one. I'm picking the short ones, not the long ones. He says, don't try constantly to explain or define for others' gratification who and what you are. Let actions and your inner reality speak for you. If others misunderstand you, where their misunderstanding is a mental feather in your cap, reflect that God alone really understands us anyway. Trying to constantly explain to others' gratification who and what you are. Isn't you find this is the motivation behind many people's conversation? You're having a conversation, and they're sometimes even interrupting. Say, well, I this, I that, I did this, this is how I feel, I'm this. Watch yourself. How many times during the day do you needlessly start a conversation or start a sentence with the word I did this, and somebody said they're talking about their trip to Italy. They're talking about their trip to Varanasi, wherever, or to Babaji's cave, and immediately you have to interject. This was my impression. You're defining yourself. Why not let the other person shine? Just listen. Say, oh, give a word of appreciation. That's wonderful. You must have had a good time, and curb that tendency to lead with the ego, lead with that sense of I-ness. It's a good exercise, and people in time will begin to actually appreciate you more for that. Now, of course, you could become egoic in your sense of wanting to, draw that appreciation. And I'm not saying to do it for that reason, but do it for that sense of exercise to keep yourself in proportion. Again, never try without some good and definite reason to justify your actions, ideas, or accomplishments. Whatever you've done, give it mentally to God. Now, this is also a difficult one. It's not something you'll find in the normal worldly context. Justification of your actions. Why did you do that? That was a failure. You've made a mess of your project. Well, I did it. It didn't work because I did it for this reason, for that reason. And you're giving excuses and explanations and justification. And sometimes, again, it's a razor's edge. Sometimes you need to explain those things in order for the good of the project, you see, in order for the good of other people, not necessarily for the good of yourself. So again, when it's not necessary to do this, let it be. Just absorb it. Absorb the criticism and see how do you feel about that. Can you be happy under all circumstances, even in the midst of those types of trials? Because those are small trials in life, and it prepares you for when the bigger things come. Because lots of times life delivers us blows, and we're accused in life of doing things that we had nothing to do with. And oftentimes here, there's that tendency to justify ourselves. Why? Is it necessary? It usually isn't. Let it be and just absorb it. It's a good practice. But again, used with discretion. Swamiji says here, it is not humility to tell yourself, I can't. Remember, God can do anything. If you give him the chance, moreover, he can do anything through you. Ask him for the inspiration, the guidance, and the strength to do whatever you must do, as Yogananda put it. Pray in this way, I will reason, I will act, but guide thou my reason, will, and activity in everything I do. I mention this one is because often, again, as I said earlier, people mistakenly have the idea of modesty and humility is to say, well, I can't do that. I'm not good enough to do that. I'm just a lowly devotee trying to do my best. And one, that's not true. I mean, maybe you're trying to do your best, but you're not lowly. And secondly, sometimes it can be a justification in its own right to not try, to not put out energy. And third, perhaps even more importantly, it's a false sense of lack of worth. It's not true. And again, inferiority or superiority, both are ego motivated and need to be overcome. We want to be moderate, even-minded. We want to be truthful of who and what we truly are. So don't think of yourself, well, I can't possibly do that. You can. And again, with God's help, bringing God into the picture, I will reason, I will, and I will act. But guide thou my reason, will, and activity in everything to the highest in what I do. In fact, try not to call attention to yourself. If you want to call attention to some thought, try to be sure in your own mind that your desire isn't based on a desire merely to be heard. Now, this is a definition I've mentioned before of silence. Silence is the overcoming of the heart's need, the soul's, the ego's need to be heard. And so when you say something, when you share something, is it really that you're trying to share the idea for some good purpose? Or is it just an expression of your individual egoic need to get your 2 cents into the conversation, you might say, to be heard? I remember years ago I was practicing silence, a good practice, and you should try it. And I happened to be in a dining room where 2 people next to me on the table were having dinner, and they were arguing about some geographical fact. Now, I happen to be quite good at geography, if I may say so. I know the capital of this country or that. And they had it wrong, both of them. And the tremendous urge within me was to just say, no, both of you are wrong. It's such and such, Delhi is the capital of India, or whatever it was. And I had to laugh at myself. I says, why? Why do I have this urge to be heard? Because it has nothing to do with me. It's trivial. It's a conversation between them. And it was a good instructive lesson that how much of life is like that. It's just a need to be heard. So this quality of modesty, learning to curb that tendency of the ego to exalt itself, but realize the deeper sense is learning to bring our inner reactive processes to the world into balance. This is what modesty really is, this moderation. It's the curbing of the waves of chitta, the curbing of the likes and dislikes of the heart, to stand firm and centered in the midst of all the fluctuations and the changes of daily life. And to stand firm is one, to curb that tendency of the ego to express itself outwardly, but it's also to stand firm is to have a one-pointed goal upon what it is that we are trying to attain in this life. Oneness with the divine, oneness with God. So just as physically, when you try to stand firm and centered, it's good to have your eyes focused and gazed upon a still object, sometimes in the distance. You keep your attention one-pointedly focused there, and the body and all the tendencies and the reactions of the physical body become restful. In the same way, we do this inwardly with our emotions, our feelings, with our thoughts, with our aspirations. Keep them on God, and you'll find that the tendency of the of the ego to go out and express itself will come to rest.